Alright, welcome to this video. Let's clean up our project, remove some old stuff and use our generated client API instead. So let me just close some information here so that we start up from a nice and clean view. Then go ahead into search flights component, which we have created, and open up the TS file. So search flights.component.ts. And now let's first of all import some more information here. So import flight service, right? This is the service that got created by using our plugin. And as I said earlier, we can inject that flight service, or we can use it now here. Let's go ahead. API/services/flight.service. There we go. So you can find that located in the API folder as we have discovered it in the last video. Now, this is the first thing. So the flight service, which is actually the way how we can now connect or get data from our backend API, and then import. We also need that data structure for sure. So it's our flight read model, and we import that from the same folder, API/models. And there we go. Now this is already set up. Let me just add a semicolon right here and here too in that line. You can see that underlined, right? So we have a conflict, and this is exactly what we need because now we know what we can remove. So let's scroll down. Here you can see the interfaces that we have created on our own in one of the first videos. So let's go ahead and remove them now. Because if we change the flight read model in the backend in ASP, we would now go ahead and have to adjust it here manually, right? And this is a problem as we have discovered already. So instead of doing that manually, we use our tool to create the client-side API, which is exactly this, or it's part of it, right? So let's remove them here because it would be a duplicate, so we don't need it. Great. Now, as I said, services are injectable. What does that mean? Injectables are like exactly in ASP.NET Core. You can use dependency injection to get a service into your class. So what we do here is we will create a constructor, and inside of that constructor, we will take the flight service. First of all, let's clear that search result because, as I already said, we will now get the data from the backend, not hard-coded in the Angular front end, right? So let's simply clear this completely up, make it an empty array. Here we have our constructor. Inside of that constructor, we now take flight service of type flight service. All right, and now we can use that flight service inside of that class. So let's create a method, which we can then attach to a search button that we have just created, right? We can keep that lifecycle hook ng on init right here, but don't create the new method inside here. So we are outside of that ng on init method. The method is called search, and we'll simply call this flight service, right? It's the one that we have just here received in the constructor from the dependency injection .flight get. We will take a look at that just in a second. And now these calls are all kind of asynchronous. So what we do here is to wait for the result and then finally subscribe something to it. Or to say it in another way, we send a request and directly subscribe something which gets executed once we have the result, right? So this is a simple asynchronous pattern. You send something, you register a listener, and once you have the response received asynchronous, the subscribed listener will get executed. So in this case, this search result equals to R. Now, what is that expression doing here? So R is the response that we receive. We can also call it response, right? R is just, well, a little bit shorter, but we can call it response. And we take that response and assign it to the search result. So this search result, which is our empty array right here, will be the response which we will receive asynchronously or by the listener we are subscribing here. Awesome. Now, as soon as we will call that method, we will use our flight service client API, which will then call flight get, and this flight get method will talk to our backend API ASP.NET Core and get some information. Afterwards, we have that response, which will then get assigned to the search results, which is data bound by us. We already did that, so we will directly see the information. However, now let's take a look at the flight get here. As I said, flight service got created when we executed our package, our ng OpenAPI generate package. Now let's take a look at flight gen. Right click on it and go to implementation. Here you can see we can set additional parameters, but we have none, right? Remember, in our controller in ASP.NET Core, on the get method that we have inside of our flight controller, there is no parameter. So this is why we don't set here any of them. This is why the braces are empty. Now the flight get is type of observable, right? And this is where asynchronous comes in. Observables are like you start them and you can subscribe a listener to it, which get executed once you have the response. So this is what an observable is doing, right? So it's not synchronous, it's asynchronous once you subscribe to it. Now take a look here, return this flight response. We pipe or map it to an array of flight read model, right? So we don't really want to focus too much on it since it's automatically maintained anyway. We really want to focus on how to use the service, not how the service is implemented, right? We really want to focus on how to use the service and not get into much detail on how it's implemented. So there are many ways to do it, right? This is just a very short way using some piping and mapping. However, in the end, the response will be type of array flight read model. And this is the only thing that's important for us to know. Now take a look at the naming convention. Why is this method called flight get? Pretty easy. In ASP.NET Core, our controller was named flight and the method in that controller was type of get. So this is flight controller get method, right? So this is just why it's getting named like this. Great. Now let's switch back. I just wanted to show you the service here and where this flight get is located and that it's type of observable and what it's doing in the end. Now here we have that search method and now we need to attach the button to it, right? So go into the template, and when I say template, I for sure mean the HTML from that component. So search flight component.html. And here we have that search button. Let's go ahead, we can also search for it. Search. Here's that button, you can find it in line 55 for me. Type submit. And now we go ahead and use an event. You already know that. We use the button click event and attach or assign a method to it, which is the search. There you go, search method that we have just created, right? So this is the search flight component HTML. So he will take a look at the search flight component.ts for a search method. So this one will get called. Now let's start our application. Simply hit Ctrl F5. And one thing to mention is every time we now change our backend, our ASP backend, we for sure have to generate the client code again. So we simply go ahead and call the npx just like we did before to update the client code. You can see some compiles error. And you can see that he has a problem with flight departure place. So what you can see here is not the ASP.NET Core backend compilation. This is the compiler of Angular, right? So you will probably see that sometimes when you develop with Angular, because if you have any mistakes, like it happens during every software development, right, you can find some information here. So let's take a look. He's complaining about object is possibly undefined flight departure place. So let's go ahead and take a look. You can see that this is happening in search flights component HTML. So let me explain you why this error is common. If you go to flight read model here, this is what got created from the package that we have used to generate the client API. And you can see this nullable here, right? So airline, arrival, departure, ID, price, they are all nullable. Well, for ID, price and airline, which are of type primitive, it's easy to define a default value, right? The default value for price would be 0 and the default value for string could potentially be empty. So something like this. For our custom interfaces, time, place, read model, for arrival and departure, we don't have that default values defined. So the problem is that he doesn't know how to handle right now how to handle a nullable. So what we need to do is we need to go to our flight component, and inside here, let's scroll to the flight departure right now. This is the first place. It's happening for departure and arrival. We set departure simply to nullable. So this is what we need to do, because once everything here is compiled, in the end, it will all be JavaScript, right? So this TypeScript in the end will become JavaScript, and we need to say how to handle this possible null object. Let's go ahead and assign this question mark to every departure. Make sure to add it not to time, but to possibly nullable departure, and also here in arrival. So everywhere where we use that, we need to add that question mark. Great. Now let's hit run and start the application again. Great, you can now see the compilation was successful. And once we now click on start, we will make a real call into our ASP.NET Core backend onto the search flight controller into the get method to get the data. You can see that here. Did you notice the little delay? Let me just reload the page. Just take a look at that very short delay. Once I click, it takes like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 milliseconds, sort of that. This is because it's an observable, right? So we send a request to our ASP.NET Core backend, it gets proceeded and it gets returned all within a couple of milliseconds or whatever. It's just that you know it's an observable, so it's asynchronous. You can see all the information that we have right here is the information which is coming from our ASP.NET Core backend. And this is really very important that you understand how this is working. You have Angular and front end, which has no data at all, right? It has an API which communicates with our RESTful web API in ASP.NET Core, which then sends data back to the client API of Angular, and Angular renders the information then throughout data binding. Never forget that API simply means Application Programming Interface. So there is a difference between our Angular API and our RESTful API in ASP.NET Core. Our ASP.NET Core API is a web API, right? And our Angular API is simply talking to that web API to receive some data. So as I said, never forget, API simply means Application Programming Interface, and it is a way how applications can connect to each other. Now let's continue with the next video. I want to show you how you can handle errors which could probably occur when you make some requests in Angular.